Black Irish. Phil Lynott's War Against Two Worlds, the question nobody could answer. What happens when an entire country loves your music but hates your face? Phil Lynott knew. He wrote Emerald and Black Rose, anthems of Irish pride that moved millions to tears. He made Ireland dance, made them proud, made them believe a skinny mixed-race kid from Crumlin could conquer the world. Yet walk down Grafton Street in 1970, and those same fans would cross the street to avoid him. This is the story of how Phil Lynott became Ireland's greatest paradox, the black man who taught white Ireland how to rock. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary tale, if you're moved by stories of artists who defied impossible odds, hit that subscribe button, because Phil's journey is about more than music. It's about identity, survival, and the price of being different in a world that demands you choose a side. Birth of a Paradox, August 20th, 1949, West Bromwich, England. Philomena Lynott, a young Irish woman barely 20 years old, held her newborn son and saw immediately what the world would never let her forget. The baby's skin was darker than hers, his features a blend of her Irish heritage and his father's Guyanese roots. Cecil Parris, the father, was already gone, another sailor passing through, leaving behind a son who would spend his entire life searching for the home he never had. But Philomena faced an impossible situation. Post-war England was hostile enough to Irish immigrants. A single Irish mother with a mixed-race child? That was social suicide. She made a decision that would haunt Phil for 36 years. She sent him to Dublin, to be raised by her parents in Crumlin, one of Dublin's working-class neighborhoods. Phil was 3 years old when he said goodbye to his mother, too young to understand he was being shipped off to a country that would love him and hate him in equal measure. Dublin in the 1950s was not ready for Philip Parris Lynott Ireland, freshly independent and fiercely Catholic, clung to its identity with desperate pride. The nation had fought centuries of British oppression, had starved through famine, had bled for independence. Irish identity meant something sacred, it meant survival. And that identity came with a very specific face, pale skin, often red hair. Celtic features passed down through generations of isolation on Europe's western edge. Then came Phil. Dark-skinned, kinky-haired, speaking with a perfect Dublin accent but looking like nobody's idea of Irish. His grandparents, Sarah and Frank Lynott, loved him fiercely. They gave him everything they could in their small terraced house on Leyland Road. But love couldn't protect him from what waited outside their door. The education of Crumlin. The first time someone called him a nanar, Phil was 5 years old. He was playing with a tin soldier outside his grandmother's house when 3 older boys surrounded him. They asked where he was from, and when he said here, they laughed. One of them spit on his soldier. Another kicked it into the gutter. The third pushed Phil down and told him to go back to Africa. Phil ran home crying, and his grandmother Sarah held him while he sobbed. But what could she tell him? That it would get better? That people would accept him? She couldn't lie. Instead, she taught him to fight, not with fists, though he'd learn that too, but with words, with pride, with an unshakable belief that he was just as Irish as any of them. School was worse. The Christian brothers who ran his school in Crumlin were strict disciplinarians who ruled with leather straps and Catholic guilt. But they had no answer for the daily torment Phil faced in the schoolyard. Chocolate drop. Half-breed. Mixed mongrel. The words came daily, casually, the way other kids might comment on the weather. Some days Phil fought back with his fists. Other days he learned to laugh it off, to make himself the joke before they could. He developed a quick wit, a sharp tongue, a way of disarming hate with humor. But the humor was armor, and beneath it the wounds kept piling up. His mother visited when she could, bringing gifts and promises that somehow never materialized into her staying. Phil adored her, but he also resented her. Why had she left him? Why did she get to escape to England while he had to face Dublin's racism alone? He never asked her these questions, not then. Irish boys in the 1950s didn't question their mothers. But the questions lived inside him, festering. By age 10, Phil had learned 3 essential truths. First, he was black, and Dublin would never let him forget it. Second, he was Irish, whether Dublin liked it or not. Third, if he was going to survive, he needed to become someone so undeniable that his skin color became irrelevant. Music would be his weapon. Music would be his salvation. Music would also eventually be his destruction. The first escape. The first time Phil picked up a guitar, he was 12 years old. A neighbor had left one in the Lynott's house, and Phil strummed it clumsily, marveling at how the strings responded to his touch. He couldn't afford lessons, so he taught himself, staying up late in his grandmother's house, his fingers bleeding as he learned chord after chord. But guitars cost money Phil didn't have. So he switched to bass, cheaper, less popular, but with a deep, throbbing sound that somehow fit him better anyway. The bass was the foundation, the backbone, the heartbeat of a band. You couldn't see it as easily as a flashy lead guitar, but without it, everything fell apart. Phil understood that. He'd spent his whole life being the thing people tried not to see but couldn't do without. By 15, Phil was playing in local bands, working construction jobs to pay for equipment. His band, the Black Eagles, played covers at youth clubs and parish halls, and something remarkable happened when Phil took the stage. The same kids who called him names in the street would dance to his music. The same adults who clutched their purses when he walked past would clap along to his bass lines. On stage for those few hours, Phil wasn't the black kid from Crumlin. He was a musician. He was an artist. He was free. But freedom, Phil learned, always came with a timer. Thin Lizzy and the Double-Edged Sword in 1969, at age 20, Phil Lynott co-founded Thin Lizzy with drummer Brian Downey and guitarist Eric Bell. The name came from a robot character in the Beano comic called Tin Lizzy, with the spelling changed to look more exotic, more rock and roll. They played Dublin's club circuit, dirty venues that reeked of cigarettes and spilled beer, where the pay was terrible and the audiences were drunk. But Phil had something the other bands didn't. He had presence. He had charisma. He had that indefinable quality that made you unable to look away. When Phil took the microphone, when he stood at the front of the stage with his bass slung low, when he sang in that rich, melodic voice, something magical happened. The room stopped. People paid attention. Critics called it exotic. They said Phil brought a different flavor to Irish rock. What they meant, but rarely said outright, was that Phil was black, and that made him interesting in a country where everyone looked the same. Phil knew this. He knew his skin color was part of his appeal, that it made him stand out in a crowded music scene. But he also knew it was a trap. If his music wasn't good enough, his race would make him a novelty, a gimmick, a flash in the pan. So the music had to be more than good. It had to be undeniable. In 1972, Thin Lizzy recorded a rock version of Whiskey in the Jar, a traditional Irish folk song about a highwayman. It was a gamble, taking a song every Irish person knew and making it something new. But Phil's version worked. His vocals gave the old song new life, and the driving rock arrangement made it impossible to ignore. Whiskey in the Jar climbed the UK charts, reaching number 6. Suddenly, Thin Lizzy wasn't just another Dublin band. They were legitimate rock stars. Phil should have been ecstatic. Instead, he felt the walls closing in, because success in Ireland came with a question Phil couldn't escape. What gave a black man the right to sing Irish songs? Conservative critics, the same ones who'd praised Phil's exotic quality, now questioned his authenticity. How dare he take Ireland's cultural heritage and profit from it? Folk purists were furious. Letters to music magazines questioned whether Phil was really Irish or just an opportunist. Phil's response was to double down on his Irish identity. If they questioned his right to sing Irish songs, he'd write his own. He'd create Irish rock anthems that nobody could deny. The Boys Are Back by 1976, Thin Lizzy had evolved. Eric Bell was gone, replaced by 2 guitarists, Scott Gorham, an American from California, and Brian Robertson, a Scot. This twin guitar attack would become Thin Lizzy's signature sound, but more importantly, it gave Phil the sonic firepower he needed to conquer more than just Ireland. The album Jailbreak was released in March 1976, and it contained the song that would define Phil's career and curse him for the rest of his life. The Boys Are Back in Town. The song was perfect, a mid-tempo rocker with infectious guitar hooks and Phil's storytelling vocals, painting pictures of working-class guys reuniting at their local bar. It was universal enough for anyone to relate to, but Irish enough that every Dublin kid recognized the characters. The song climbed charts worldwide, reaching number 12 in the US and number 8 in the UK. Suddenly, Phil Lynott was everywhere. Top of the Pops appearances, American tours opening for massive bands, magazine covers. The kid from Crumlin who'd been called Nunner on his way to school was now an international rock star, And Ireland, conflicted Ireland, didn't know what to do with him. The pride was real. Dublin kids wore Thin Lizzy t-shirts. Bars played The Boys Are Back in Town on repeat. Phil was Ireland's biggest rock export, and in the mid-1970s, Ireland desperately needed something to be proud of. The troubles were raging in Northern Ireland. Bombs were going off, the economy was struggling. Phil's success was a beacon of hope, proof that an Irish kid could make it on the world stage. But the old questions lingered in whispers, in sideways glances, in the way journalists would ask Phil about his heritage instead of just calling him Irish. He was celebrated, yes, but always with that invisible asterisk, the black Irish rock star, the mixed-race success story. Never just Irish, never just one of their own. Phil felt it. He felt it in interviews where reporters asked about his father, the absent Guyanese sailor, instead of his grandmother who'd raised him. He felt it when he walked through Dublin and people asked for autographs but still looked uncomfortable standing too close. He felt it when he wrote songs about Irish mythology, and critics praised them as interpretations rather than authentic expressions. The war between his two worlds wasn't getting easier with success. It was getting louder. The Marriage and the Mask in 1980, Phil Lynott married Caroline Crowther, the daughter of British comedian and TV presenter Leslie Crowther. Caroline was blonde, beautiful, and from a completely different world than Phil's Crumlin upbringing. They'd met in the mid-1970s, and Phil had pursued her with the same intensity he brought to music. Their wedding was covered by magazines, photographs showing Phil in a stylish suit, Caroline radiant in white. They had two daughters, Sarah, born in 1978, and Kathleen in 1980. Phil adored his daughters. He spoke about them constantly in interviews, showed their photos, talked about wanting to be a better father than his own had been. Finally, Phil thought, he had something his race couldn't touch. A family, a wife who loved him, children who would never question whether they belonged. But fame and family don't mix well, especially when the fame is built on touring and the family is left behind. Phil was constantly on the road. Thin Lizzy's success meant months away from home, living in hotels and tour buses, surrounded by groupies and drugs and the endless temptations of rock stardom. Phil had always liked to drink. That was standard in Irish rock culture. But on American tours, he was introduced to something darker. Heroin. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, heroin was everywhere in rock music. It was the drug of the cool kids, the outlaws, the rebels. Phil, always searching for belonging, found it in the needle. The drug that promised to quiet the war inside him only made it worse. Caroline noticed the changes. Phil would come home from tours different, thinner, more paranoid, more distant. The man she'd married was disappearing, replaced by someone who needed the drug more than he needed her. They fought. She begged him to get help. Phil promised he would, then went back on the road and back to the needle. Their marriage crumbled slowly, painfully, publicly. Tabloids covered every fight, every separation, every tearful reconciliation. Phil's personal life became entertainment for the masses, just another story about a rock star who couldn't handle success. The same Ireland that had celebrated his wedding now gossiped about his failures as a husband and father. By 1983, Caroline had had enough. She left, taking Sarah and Kathleen with her. Phil was devastated, but he also couldn't blame her. He knew what he'd become. He knew the heroin had eaten away at everything good in his life. He knew he was losing the war, not just with his identity, but with himself. The dagger falls that same year, 1983. Thin Lizzy played their farewell tour. The band that had defined Irish rock was calling it quits, and everyone knew why. Phil's drug use had made him unreliable. Shows were canceled. Studio sessions were disasters. The twin guitars that had once sounded so powerful now felt hollow, because the man holding it all together was falling apart. The farewell tour was bittersweet. Sold-out crowds singing along to every word, fans crying, knowing they were witnessing the end of an era. Phil gave everything he had left on those stages, but anyone paying attention could see the truth. He was sick. His skin had a grayish tint. He'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. His hands shook between songs. After Thin Lizzy ended, Phil tried to start fresh with a new band called Grand Slam. It should have been his comeback, his redemption arc. Instead, it was painful to watch. Grand Slam couldn't get a record deal. Shows were sparsely attended. The magic that had carried Phil through Thin Lizzy was gone, consumed by heroin and heartbreak and the exhaustion of fighting his entire life. Ireland watched Phil Lynott destroy himself, and the pity was almost worse than the old racism. Now when people saw him on Dublin streets, they didn't call him names. They looked away, embarrassed. They whispered to their friends about how sad it was what happened to Phil Lynott. The same country that had questioned his Irish identity now mourned the loss of their prodigal son. But mourning him while he was still alive felt like giving up, and Phil couldn't stand pity. Christmas 1985, December 25, 1985. Phil Lynott collapsed at his home in Surrey, England. His mother, Philomena, found him unconscious and called an ambulance. He was rushed to Salisbury Infirmary, where doctors discovered the extent of the damage. His heart was failing. His kidneys were shutting down. Years of heroin abuse had destroyed his body from the inside out. He was 36 years old, and his organs were failing like those of an 80-year-old man. Phil lingered for over a week, drifting in and out of consciousness. His mother sat by his bedside, holding the hand of the son she'd sent away 33 years earlier. Carolyn brought the daughters to say goodbye, though they were too young to fully understand they were losing their father. Brian Downey, Phil's drummer and oldest friend, visited and wept at what Phil had become. On January 4, 1986, Philip Parris Lynott died of pneumonia and heart failure brought on by septicemia. The official cause listed drug-related complications, but the truth was messier. Phil had died of a broken heart that had been cracking since childhood. He'd died of a war between two identities that he'd fought alone for 36 years. He'd died searching for home in a world that never quite let him have one. Ireland's response was immediate and overwhelming. They built him a statue. The statue on Grafton Street, August 19, 2005, almost 20 years after Phil's death. A bronze statue was unveiled on Harry Street, just off Dublin's famous Grafton Street. Phil stands larger than life, his bass guitar slung across his body, his face captured in mid-performance. Thousands attended the unveiling. Fans who'd grown up with Thin Lizzy, musicians who'd been inspired by Phil's courage, politicians who suddenly wanted to claim him as Ireland's own. But Phil's daughters, Sarah and Kathleen, weren't there. They'd been invited, but chose not to attend. Some said it was too painful. Others whispered that the girls resented how Ireland treated their father, celebrated him in death after making his life so difficult. The statue stands as Ireland's confession. The country that had called young Philip names, that had questioned his right to sing Irish songs, that had watched him destroy himself now wanted to claim him as a hero. The plaque calls him Ireland's first black rock star, as if that label somehow makes up for the lifetime spent being told he wasn't Irish enough. Tourists take photos with the statue now. They pose with bronze Phil, smiling, unaware of the war this man fought just to exist. Dubliners walk past it daily, most without a second glance. The statue has become part of the scenery, just another landmark in a city full of history. But if you stand there at night, when the tourists are gone and the pubs are closing, you might feel something. A restlessness, a question that still hasn't been answered. What are you? That question, the one Phil heard his entire life, never got easier. Not with fame, not with hit songs, not with a statue bearing his name. What are you? People would ask, and Phil never had an answer they'd accept. Say he was Irish, and people pointed to his skin. Say he was black, and people asked why he had a Dublin accent. Say he was both, and people looked confused as if being two things at once was impossible. But Phil was both. He was the boy from Crumlin who got called Ninter on his way to school and the rock star who wrote anthems of Irish pride. He was the abandoned son of a Guyanese sailor and the beloved grandson of Sarah and Frank Lynott. He was the husband who loved his daughters desperately and the addict who chose heroin over family. He was Ireland's greatest rock export and the outsider who never quite belonged. Phil Lynott lived in the space between two worlds, and that space killed him. The heroin that stopped his heart on January 4, 1986, wasn't just a drug. It was an escape from a war he could never win. Because how do you fight for acceptance in two worlds that both reject you? How do you find home when you're told you don't belong anywhere? How do you build an identity when everyone wants to split you in half? Phil tried to answer with music. Emerald, Black Rose, Roisin Dubh, songs drenched in Celtic mythology proving his Irish credentials. But also songs like Johnny the Fox about outsiders and criminals and people who didn't fit society's boxes. Phil sang for everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. He sang for the mixed kids, the immigrants, the ones who spoke with one accent but looked like they should have another. And people listened. Millions of people. Because Phil's war wasn't just his own. It was the war of anyone who'd ever been caught between two identities, two cultures, two worlds that both claimed and rejected them simultaneously. The legacy of the fight today. Dublin is different than it was in 1949 when Phil was born. Immigration has changed Ireland's face. Walk through the city now and you'll see people of every skin color, every ethnicity, every possible combination of identities. Ireland, once so homogeneous, has become beautifully diverse. But the question remains, would Phil Lynott have had an easier time if he'd been born 30 years later? Would modern Ireland embrace him more fully? Or would he still face the same questions, the same doubts, the same insistence that he choose one identity over the other? The truth is, Phil didn't just fight racism in 1950s and 60s Dublin. He fought something deeper. The human need to categorize, to put people in boxes, to make sense of them by simplifying their complexity. And that fight isn't over. It's still being waged by every mixed-race child, every immigrant, every person who doesn't fit neatly into society's predetermined categories. Phil's music endures because it speaks to that fight. The Boys Are Back in Town isn't just about nostalgia. It's about belonging, about having a place where people know your name. Emerald isn't just about Irish pride. It's about claiming an identity that tries to deny you. Parisian Walkways, Phil's collaboration with Gary Moore, isn't just a beautiful guitar piece. It's about longing for something you can't quite reach. These songs are Phil's war cry, and they're still being heard. Young musicians in Dublin cite Phil as an influence, not just his bass playing or his songwriting, but his courage. The courage to stand on stage when people questioned your right to be there. The courage to write songs about your culture when others said it wasn't yours to claim. The courage to be yourself when the world wanted you to be simpler, easier to understand, less complicated. Phil lost his personal war. The heroin won. The identity crisis won. The accumulated weight of 36 years of fighting won. But his music won something too. It won the right for complicated people to exist. It won space for those who don't fit boxes. It won a place in Irish history for a black man whose Irishness should never have been questioned. The answer? Phil never got. The statue on Grafton Street offers a kind of answer to the question Phil heard his whole life. What are you? Ireland's answer 2 decades too late is, you're ours. You're Irish, you always were. But Phil needed that answer when he was 8 and being pelted with rocks. He needed it when he was 15 and playing bass in youth clubs, wondering if music could save him. He needed it when he wrote Emerald, and critics called it an interpretation instead of authentic expression. He needed it when Caroline left and his daughters were taken away and heroin became the only home that would have him. The answer came as bronze and metal, silent and still, unable to feel the validation it represented. Phil never saw his statue, never walked past it on Grafton Street and thought, finally, I'm home. He died believing he was still fighting, still proving himself, still caught between two worlds that wouldn't let him rest. And maybe that's the tragedy at the heart of Phil Lynott's story. Not that he died young, not that heroin killed him, but that he died still fighting for an acceptance that came only after he couldn't appreciate it. What happens when a country loves your music but hates your face? We started with that question, and now we have Phil's answer. What happens is you fight. You fight every day. You fight with music and words and presence. You fight by becoming so undeniable that people have to see past what they hate to what they love. You fight by writing songs that become anthems, by playing bass lines that become legendary, by standing on stages and refusing to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. And sometimes, despite all that fighting, you lose. You lose to drugs. You lose to depression. You lose to the accumulated weight of a lifetime spent explaining yourself, justifying your existence, proving you belong. But here's what Phil didn't lose. The music. The Boys Are Back in Town still plays in bars across the world. Emerald still gives Irish people chills. Whiskey in the Jar still makes people dance. These songs outlived Phil's body, outlived the heroin, outlived the questions about his identity. Because music, unlike people, doesn't care what color you are. Music doesn't need you to choose between identities. Music just is, and in being, it tells the truth about who we are. Phil Lynott was black. Phil Lynott was Irish. Phil Lynott was a rock star and a junkie, a husband and an absent father, a hero and a cautionary tale. He was all of these things at once, and none of them cancel each other out. His life was complicated and messy and tragic and beautiful, just like the music he left behind. Ireland built him a statue, and maybe that's their way of saying sorry. Sorry for the names, the doubts, the questions. Sorry it took his death to see what should have been obvious all along, that Phil Lynott was one of their greatest sons and his skin color was irrelevant to that truth. But statues can't hug you back. Bronze can't tell you that you belong. Metal can't heal the wounds of a childhood spent being told you're not enough, so the question remains, what happens when a country loves your music but hates your face? Phil Lynott's answer, written in songs and sealed with his death, is that you create something so beautiful they have no choice but to love all of you. You make music that lasts longer than prejudice. You write songs that outlive hate. You stand on stage and play your bass and sing in your perfect Dublin accent and dare anyone to say you're not Irish enough. And maybe, if you're lucky, someday they'll build you a statue. It'll come too late to save you, too late to heal you, too late to give you the home you spent your whole life searching for. But it'll stand there on Grafton Street as proof that you existed, that you mattered, that you were Irish whether they liked it or not. Phil Lynott was black Irish, not black, not Irish, both, always both. And his war against two worlds became the soundtrack for anyone who's ever felt caught between identities, searching for a home that accepts all of who they are. The statue stands silent, but the music still speaks. And in that music, if you listen closely, you can hear Phil's answer to the question that haunted him. What are you? I'm Parris Lynott. I'm from Crumlin. I play bass. I write songs. I'm Irish, I'm black, I'm both. I'm neither. I'm everything you said I couldn't be. And my music will outlive your doubt. That's what happens when a country loves your music but hates your face. You become immortal, and they become embarrassed. You win, even in death. Because the songs last longer than the hate.